On this Sunday night, criticism over Kabul. The federal Liberals respond to calls for Canada to do more to rescue Canadians and their allies from Afghanistan.
We know that the conditions are dangerous and the images that we are seeing are heartbreaking.
Here comes Henri. The tropical storm soaks the northeastern United States, now carving a path towards Canada. Remembering Jack, the NDP pays tribute 10 years since the passing of a political giant. Plus, COVID-19 and the campaign. A look behind the scenes covering an election in a pandemic.
Global National with Robin Gill. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin again tonight with the dire situation in Afghanistan. Government ministers held a press conference to address concerns about Canadians and Afghans desperate to escape the Taliban-controlled country. The defense minister says the government and armed forces are working tirelessly and promised Canadian rescue flights will continue, in his words, as long as it is safe to do so.
The security situation around the airport is making it increasingly difficult for people to get there. The area around the airport is intensely crowded and violence in the area is increasing.
Canada airlifted another 121 people from Afghanistan yesterday, including Canadian citizens, their families, and Afghan nationals. So far, 12 Canadian flights have evacuated more than 1,100 people, including one family who arrived just in time to welcome their newest member.
Some 1,000 Afghans have arrived on Canadian soil, including a baby girl born this weekend. They'll be starting a new life here.
But many other Canadians remain caught in Kabul, while some allies, such as the U.S. and France, are sending buses with special forces to drive their citizens to the airport. Canadians are being told to make their own way through the chaotic crowds outside the gates. Mercedes Stephenson is traveling with Justin Trudeau's campaign and has been following developments. Mercedes.
Liberal leader Justin Trudeau is swinging east, hoping to win over Atlantic Canada. But he's not been able to leave behind the issue that keeps dogging his campaign, Canada's response to the crisis in Afghanistan. Today, Trudeau defended his government's handling of the situation.
I don't want to go into details, operational details right now, but I can assure you we have given the authorizations for the folks on the ground to make the right decisions to help as many people as possible, given the risks of the situation.
Nobody was able to recognize them.
Maruf is an Afghan interpreter who worked with the Canadian Special Operations Forces. We are concealing his identity for his safety. He and his wife and 5 children, ages 8 and younger, were called to the airport 2 days ago by the Canadian government. The Canadian government is telling people to wear red and yell Canada to get through the gates. Maruf says he yelled for nearly 36 hours in the crowded and dangerous perimeter of the airport with no success.
And that day we spent all night over there. The children, the old women, the women's, all they were mixed up into rush and crowd, and it was like a doomsday.
Maruf is afraid for his life and wants to know why Canada has not taken the same actions as its allies, sending special forces, Maruf's former colleagues who are at the airport, out to collect evacuees.
What was happened to Canada? Canada is my favorite country, and I have worked with them, and I know their honesty, their ability. What was the reason that they were so far away from the management?
Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan hinted there may be more latitude.
There's a reason why we have sent our special forces on the ground, because they have the training, the ability to take opportunities.
Despite criticism from interpreters on the ground, the government insisted they are performing well.
Pleased to report that we've now evacuated a little bit more than 1,000, which is nothing short of miraculous.
The Liberals have faced intense criticism of their response to Afghanistan. Too slow, too little, too late. And while the Liberal leader continues to make his way across Canada, there's no sign he'll be able to leave this issue behind. Mercedes Stephenson, Global News, Miramichi.
And outside that airport in Kabul, at least 7 more Afghan civilians died today in a panicked crush trying to flee the country. The U.S. National Security Advisor, meanwhile, is again warning the Taliban to let every American leave or face consequences. Jennifer Johnson reports.
Heavily armed Taliban soldiers have set up checkpoints around Kabul, searching cars and questioning Afghans, cracking down to ensure law and order.
Calm down. Calm down.
Outside Kabul's airport, there is no order. Afghans are suffering bone-crushing injuries and deaths as thousands crowd together begging to leave the country. Hundreds are also suffering from dehydration.
We've seen these wrenching scenes of people crowded at the gates, people hurt, people killed. It's an incredibly volatile situation.
U.S. officials insist they are moving troops outside the airport to keep people from being crushed to death and getting as many people out as fast as they can.
We have sufficient forces on the ground, but every single day the president asks his military commanders, including those at the airport, whether they need additional resources.
For Afghans who aided the U.S. and its allies, there is overwhelming concern for family members still in the country, including this woman who was afraid to be identified.
They are in danger because I was working with many organizations. Maybe if they are not finding me, they attacked my family.
One woman was so desperate to escape her homeland, she gave birth on a military aircraft moments after it landed in Germany. Those arriving in the U.S. are receiving aid from groups of Afghan Americans, trying to help the refugees rebuild their lives.
Most of them were very depressed. They had so many people left behind.
U.S. President Joe Biden held an unusual Sunday press conference after ordering private airline companies to fly refugees out of U.S. air bases outside of Afghanistan.
At these sites where they're landing, we are conducting thorough scrutiny, security screening. Anyone arriving in the United States will have undergone a background check.
Biden is still facing worldwide criticism for announcing he's pulling U.S. troops out of the country by the end of the month, even from former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, an ally.
It's tragic what's happened. I think it's unnecessary. I think we've made a serious mistake in doing this in this way.
Leaders of the G7 meet next week, strategizing on how to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a terrorist breeding ground and protecting those left behind. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
Turning now to the federal election campaign, and the Conservatives unveiled a bold plan to help those with drug addictions. Erin O'Toole spent the morning at a drug recovery centre in BC's Lower Mainland. Abigail Bimman has more on O'Toole's plan to tackle the opioid crisis.
Chris Esnard was in a very difficult and dark place a few years ago.
Cocaine. Yeah, a lot of it too. You know, it wasn't a small amount.
It took 2 stints and years at this recovery center to help change Esnard's life. Now his children speak to him again.
I'm the happiest in my life I've ever been. I feel fulfilled. I don't hurt anybody. I don't cause any problems. I'm not breaking the law. My kids want to talk to me. You know, my wife, she's my friend. You know, we can talk again. You know, we can parent our kids together. I didn't have those opportunities before.
I don't think someone with an addiction should be punished. I think they should be helped.
With a plan much more left-leaning than Conservative leaders past, Erin O'Toole is promising more centres like this one. $325 million for 1,000 new beds and 50 recovery centres, $1 billion for Indigenous mental health and addictions, and free access to naloxone kits across the country. And he said he wouldn't shut down safe injection sites.
First of all, the announcement is fantastic. So far out of all the federal parties, the Conservative Party is the first one to actually talk about recovery and wellness along with consumption sites.
But O'Toole wasn't clear on support for decriminalization of small amounts of harder drugs. The city of Vancouver is currently working on a plan for that.
We'd like to see more judicial discretion here to get treatment options for people with an addiction and not have them held back in their recovery and future employment by a criminal sanction. And I have a lot of faith that the court can balance off those factors.
And while the promises may sound a little more orange than blue, the NDP and some harm reduction advocates say it doesn't go far enough.
We believe that the approach needs to be to declaring a public health emergency, to taking on Big Pharma.
Really what you have to look at is people are dying from toxic drugs,
and they need access to safer regulated drugs.
Conservatives head back to Ottawa now, wrapping their first week on the campaign trail with several announcements like this one aiming to target more progressive voters. And early polling shows it may be working, with the gap between Conservatives and Liberals shrinking. Jeff?
Abigail Bimman in Richmond, BC tonight. Thanks, Abigail. The NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, spent today in Toronto, paying tribute to a man who made history before his life was cut short. Today marks 10 years since Jack Layton passed away from cancer, just months after he led what became known as the Orange Crush, winning 103 seats in the 2011 election and becoming the country's official opposition. To commemorate his legacy, Singh wants to see Layton's home riding renamed in his honor. Mike Couture explains.
When Jack Layton died 10 years ago, chalk messages of condolences filled the walls of Toronto's Nathan Phillips Square. So it was fitting, on the anniversary of the former NDP leader's passing, the current leader came here to add his own tribute.
We are going to carry the torch for you. So we are going to keep on fighting for that vision that Jack had of a better Canada, of a better world.
Layton propelled the NDP to historic heights in 2011 during the Orange Wave. The party won 103 seats, making the NDP the official opposition. Singh has invoked the late leader's memory many times in the first week of the campaign, and he went even further Sunday, announcing after the election he will introduce a bill in the House of Commons to rename Layton's former riding from Toronto Danforth to Danforth Layton in memory of Jack, a move some believe could be politically opportunistic in the middle of an election campaign.
It's appropriate and an important time. 10 years later, I wanted to contribute something to remember Jack, to remember his legacy, to remember what he's done. And it's not without precedent. We've seen this for other notable members of parliament or notable political leaders that ridings have been named in their honor.
There are a number of ridings named after historic political figures, including Justin Trudeau's riding in Montreal, which is named after Joseph Papineau, who was a political figure in the 1700s. Hello. Jack Layton's son Mike is a city councillor in Toronto. He sees the renaming as an honor, not political.
While he didn't live in that riding, he worked for that riding and for the people of that riding for a lot of years. It's certainly a lovely gesture to be made to the family and to Jack's legacy.
Noticeably missing from the event was Layton's widow and former NDP MP Olivia Chow. Now, party officials tell us she wanted to spend the morning alone, but Chow will be attending a virtual concert this evening celebrating Layton's legacy. Jeff?
Mike Couture traveling with the NDP in Toronto. Thanks, Mike. And Mike will be back a little later with a look behind the scenes of covering the campaign in the pandemic. Plus, a storm surge warning in several states as Henri roars ashore. Welcome back. The U.S. East Coast is being battered by Tropical Storm Henri. The weather system was downgraded from a hurricane shortly before making landfall near westerly Rhode Island, but the storm is still packing a punch with gusts of up to 113 kilometers an hour and relentless rain. As Ross Lord explains, Henri is not the only extreme weather event hitting North America.
Considering it made landfall as a tropical storm instead of a hurricane, Henri is still having a troubling impact in parts of New England and in New York State.
I'm asking you, Rhode Island, to stay home until this storm passes. This is not the time to go out and see the waves or explore downed trees. This is the time to stay home and stay safe.
The problem is that as Henri weakened, it also started moving more slowly on its indirect path toward the Maritimes.
It's very troubling. It has slowed down, and as a result, considerable amounts of very heavy rain, storm surge along the Long Island, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and southern Massachusetts coast.
Retired meteorologist Jim Abraham, who's also a climate change researcher, notes hurricanes have become a smaller part of the extreme weather equation.
The atmosphere now is 1.2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial age. That's able to hold more moisture, but it's also able to provide more heat. So we end up with heat extremes, drought extremes, or precipitation extremes.
This year's long series of devastating weather extremes keeps getting longer. Saturday's torrential rainfall in Tennessee dumped almost 400 millimeters in some communities, leaving people trapped in their homes with no way to get out. At least 10 people are dead and dozens more are missing.
There's houses moved off their foundation, cars and trees. I mean, this is almost to biblical proportions here.
Sometimes it's the unnamed storms that do the most damage. As for Henri, forecasters say the Maritimes will feel some wind and rain, but no major impacts when what's left of the storm blows through in the next day or two. Ross Lord, Global News.
To Haiti now, where rescue teams are still searching for survivors from last weekend's devastating earthquake. Mexican rescuers have now arrived in the country to help sift through that debris. More than 2,000 people were killed in the magnitude 7.2 quake, and more than 300 people are still missing. Ahead, Meng Wanzhou's extradition hearing wraps up. The ruling and the consequences for Canadians behind bars in China. The extradition hearing of Chinese telecom executive Meng Wanzhous finally concluded this past week in Vancouver, nearly 3 years since her arrest. It marks a major step closer to a conclusion for the high-profile case, which could carry consequences far beyond the courthouse. Meng Wanzhous left the Vancouver courthouse for what could be one of the final times. The Huawei executive's extradition hearing wrapped up Wednesday, nearly 3 years since her arrest rocked Canada-China relations, with Beijing detaining 2 Canadians and sentencing another to death. Their fates, as well as Meng's, may now rest in the hands of the BC judge.
The Chinese government has been clear, if Mrs. Meng is not returned to China, there will be no progress.
Meng was arrested at the request of the United States and accused of lying to HSBC back in 2013 about Huawei's business dealings in Iran, in violation of U.S. sanctions. Meng's lawyers argued she never misled the bank, and the fraud charges are purely political.
Meng Wanzhous is a political pawn. She's been caught in the middle of this U.S.-China trade fight, and that this case is about trade, it's about geopolitics, it's about leverage, but it's not about justice.
HSBC suffered no actual financial loss as a result, but the Crown argued Meng put the British bank at risk.
This is unusual because the U.S. has put so much effort into an allegation of fraud that occurred outside the United States, not by an American and not necessarily with an American victim.
At times during the hearing, the judge sounded similarly skeptical of the charges. At one point, even asking the prosecution, isn't it unusual that one would see a fraud case with no actual harm many years later, and one in which the alleged victim, a large institution, appears to have numerous people within the institution who had all the facts that are now said to have been misrepresented?
Well, the questions that she asked and the comments that she made seem to indicate that she's not impressed by the strength of the evidence.
But impressed or not, the bar for extradition in Canada is low. Over the past decade, Canada has only rejected about 1% of U.S. extradition requests.
Well, it's, of course, much, much lower than a criminal trial. It is to show that you have the right person and there's enough of a case there to warrant the surrender.
The judge will set a date for her ruling in October, but the final decision will then fall to Canada's Justice Minister. If Meng loses, she's expected to appeal. That could see the case drag on for years, with Canadians caught in the middle. And you can hear much more on this and other stories on my new podcast, China Rising. It explores the growing political tensions between China, Canada, and its allies, from pandemic disinformation to hostage diplomacy. Subscribe for free now, wherever you get your podcasts. Still ahead, Jagmeet Singh's pandemic playbook, a look inside the NDP campaign amid COVID. This election campaign is swapping shaking hands and kissing babies with elbow bumps and virtual town halls. The pandemic is changing how leaders get their message in front of Canadians. Global News is going behind the scenes with party leaders to see how they're conducting the campaign in a time of COVID. Our Michael Couture is on the road with Jagmeet Singh's NDP, and here's his reporter's notebook from the campaign trail.
What a difference 2 years makes. On day one of the campaign, Jagmeet Singh hopped on his chartered plane to crisscross the country. Compare that to 2019, where it took nearly 2 weeks for the NDP leader to leave his bus tour of the greater Toronto area. But while he's getting to more places, he can't necessarily get as close to people because of the pandemic. COVID-19 has forced all leaders to adapt. The hugs and handshakes have been replaced with elbow bumps and waves. It's a challenge for politicians like Singh, who thrive in close quarters.
I would love to be in big crowds and enjoy that energy. So we're going to have to do things differently, but we'll adapt. Oh my goodness, comment ça va?
And clearly adapting takes a bit of time, especially when Singh's first event of the campaign was marching in the Montreal Pride Parade, where personal space was at a premium. It's forcing all parties to conduct hybrid campaigns.
I hereby declare.
His nomination meeting, which would have seen a huge rally in his Burnaby riding, was instead virtual from a Vancouver hotel.
Stop lying to Canadians, Jagmeet!
Public events do have some pitfalls, as the NDP learned the hard way in Toronto.
Hi.
And Singh still tries to get out and connect with voters, pounding the pavement with his candidate, looking for votes. There has been one large crowd, that was in Edmonton, and Singh clearly craves more of it.
Flower on the hands. Yeah.
Despite the limits of pressing the flesh, Singh is rolling forward, hoping to flip ridings that went to the Conservatives and Liberals in 2019. Some party sources estimate they could gain up to 12 new seats, while others are even more ambitious, believing double that number of ridings are well within reach. A far cry from the 2019 campaign, when the goal was to limit the damage and limit the number of seats they knew they were going to lose. Mike Lecouture, Global News, Toronto.
And here's a virtual TV elbow bump. That is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is Mississauga River near Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Thanks for watching. Donna Friesen will be back here with you tomorrow. Have a great night.